Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and good morning, Deepa ji, for a very fine introduction and for all the trouble I've led you into with all this digital, whatever it is. I'm tech challenged, and I have not made any efforts to come up to the standards of the younger people as far as digital communication is concerned. Anyway, I am now on my third, well, I finished my third novel in 2018 and abandoned the fourth, to which I will go back. So it was rather late in the day to start on a novel for me. As we say in Urdu, umr to kati sari, ishke buta mein momin, ab आखिरी वक्त क्या खाक novelist होंगे या मुसलमान होंगे. So, but whenever I take up a genre, I take it up seriously. I started on the short story later than my poetry, and my first book I was not happy with it at all, but I graduated. I am a serious short story writer and a equally serious novelist. The novel or the novella plays around in my mind and in my subconscious most of the time. Now, the first thing about a novel is that you are not writing, or at least I'm not writing about a particular incident. I will not write a novel, say, on the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. Nor is this one, the one I am speaking on, is a novel on the emergency. The emergency is the start. And in fact, I'll read the start a little later. So you start with a vague and a nebulous blueprint. A novel is not a surveyor's report that you start with a diagram and of the street and what you are going to develop. The blueprint is very vague, and as you go along, the novel comes up. For instance, one of the main characters is not a main character, but she is the fulcrum around which many of the events unfold. And her name is Elham, and she is the daughter of the servant lady. And she gets those dreams of the occult. I must confess, while I was writing the novel, I came across the word occult. And I said, why can't I push something occult in my novel? These things happen. I mean, everything is not pre-planned. And then she predicts Mrs. Gandhi's, going to jail, etc., etc. I don't want to reveal the plot. I don't know whether even a single person in the audience has read the novel earlier. So, and that became a plot line, a part of the plot line. So, as Walter Scott is supposed to have said, that you sit down to write, but there is a demon sitting on the pen. And the demon takes the story, the novel, or the poem where it wants. The second thing about it is that the craft, the mechanics is a crude word for something creative, but you have to, the mechanics have to be unobtrusive. The craft has to be unobtrusive. It has to slide into the piece of art or craft that you are going ahead with. I won't bring in the parallelism of poetry because that is a different genre. But whatever you say, whatever you do, it has to be slightly unobtrusive. The joints should not be very visible in a piece of art. I mean, I'm sorry to call a novel or a story a piece of art, but it is. So the craft has to be unobtrusive. And that is what I feel. That is not what everyone feels, but I certainly do. I would want to, and the other thing is important. You must not be conscious of your intentions, conscious of your craft. For instance, I'm sorry to make a debunking remark, but I find a lot of partition fiction stilted because there is an agenda. If you have an agenda, if a novelist has an agenda, it has to be slightly unobtrusive. The agenda behind partition fiction was that you must show the Hindus are as bad as the Muslims, the Hindus and the Sikhs on one side, the Muslims on the other, equally bad, equally bloodthirsty, and at times equally decent. So the balance had to be kept all the time, and that ruined a lot of partition fiction. I think we are getting out of that stranglehold. Now that I read about partition fiction, the newer writing on partition fiction is better than the old one. I'll take you across the novel for a brief 5 minutes so that you have a glimpse of what I'm writing. I start with, I'll read the first passage a little later, but I start with the emergency. And please don't forget that the emergency, as far as me as a writer, was a part of an allegory. Allegory is very important. And I thought of an allegory also for the present times, what we are going through. I have been a member of the National Commission for Minorities for 3 years, and then that changed my outlook. 3 years, I went to every riot scene from 2011 to 2014. That was the Congress government, and there were many riots. Now there are none, thank God. But there was a different atmosphere, and I don't want to talk about it. But it changed my outlook. And for instance, I do a lot of political writing. I write a column in the Tribune every fortnight. I think on next Sunday, my column will again be coming. It is called Musings and Maledictions. So I vent my thoughts there as well. The novel has to be era. The novel is not just one incident around which I mean, there are the novels on Dalits, on a atrocity, and an entire novel around it. I cannot do it. I must have space in front of me, must have the saga, must have, again, if I may use the word space. An era has to be talked about. And what is much more important is that there are two views. There is the falcon's view, the eagle's view, the bird flying in the skies and looking at the globe. So that's one, the wide-angled lens, if you may call it. And there has to be the other camera for the nitty-gritty. Because if you only have the wide-angle lens, then you are talking in space. And I want the novel to be real, to be close to the ground, and to have the reek and the feel of the earth. I mean, like the first monsoon and जो महक आती है जमीन से बारिश के बाद, that is very important. So to get back to what I was trying to say, I write about people. Okay, but first give me the time to talk about the novel. This lady, Seema, marries an IAS officer who's a deputy secretary or a director who luckily gets into the PM's secretariat or the PM's, in those days it was called the Prime Minister's Secretariat. And immediately this girl resents, of course, the emergency and all the measures that are taken there. She has a small pad left by her mother and her father in the Kangra Hills. She goes there to write about a book, and she comes back to Lucknow, where she has a house. And the novel starts when she comes back, and she has a problem with the police and the medical staff, which are indulging in forced sterilizations. Sterilization is also a metaphor. It can be the sterilization of a community. It can be the sterilization of independent feeling in a population. So I've also used that as a metaphor, but it is the reader who has to think of the events which are full of the reek of life, that there is also a metaphor behind what is going on in the novel. And the allegory goes on. For example, there is a Nirupam Khera who talks about who becomes a leader and for pro-emergency. And we've had instances even lately of very well-known actors who have taken the side of the state. The state, what shall we say, was behind the emergency, and the state is behind so many things that are going on these days all over in the universities, in Jamia, in JNU. So that has to be also kept in mind. At least I had that in mind. She goes to Delhi, where her husband is, and uh, the the talk between them, the dialogue between them. The dialogue is not always speech. It is two opposing viewpoints, and that the husband is not very pro the emergency, but he says, I have a job, and if I talk against the emergency, I'll lose my job. And what will you do after that? So that goes on. And eventually, she has, during the very first important scene, she has spotted a shop which is being locked up by the police. The man happens to be a former Jansang shopkeeper, and she and foreign correspondents Alfred Hemmings. They talk about it, etc. It's a long story. I can't go about it with from incident to incident. But uh, Alfred Hemmings from the Christian Science Monitor comes to her house and says, "This is an envelope. I have been a tenant in this uncle's house, Ram Dollar Pandey, who is actually formerly Ram Dulare Pandey. But since he becomes he goes to England, he changes his name to Ram Dollar Pandey, easy on the British tongue. And he is in trouble because he has been charged with his wife's murder. And that is never revealed in the novel whether he actually committed the murder, he burnt his wife, or he did not. And the state was in a mood for vendetta. But the tilt is that he, for all you know, he may have committed it. We don't know. And Seema is asked to go and deliver this envelope. This envelope also contains a lot of money. And she manages to go, delivers it to the man, never meets him. The woman comes out, gives it to him, and she vanishes away. Later on, the police charges the man with murder, and she appears in trial, and the husband is appalled absolutely that she should have had anything to do with all this. The husband also changes his cadre because he was, without telling his wife, the wife had a house in Lucknow, and he changes it to Patna, to Bihar, without telling her, without consulting her. When anyway, I don't want to reveal the whole plot. Now, these things happen when you are writing, and I will read the very first passage, which is a sort of a prologue. And I wrote, before I wrote the novel, okay, sorry, an important part of the novel is the mother. The mother leaves a journal, and the mother is taken to Canada by her father, and they stay in Canada for 10 years or 12 years. And before the First War, they move because of the Kamagata Maru. I don't know whether you know it, that big ship with most of the Sikh people wanted to get to Canada, and they were prevented, and the whole ship was sent back to Calcutta, where the Indian policemen shot at them, and at least 18 or 19 people were shot dead. It is supposed to be a very big event in nationalist history. And she comes in touch with M.N. Roy when they move from Canada after taking part in the Komagata Maru thing. They moved to USA, and then from there to Mexico, because Mexico was neutral during the war. And she becomes the secretary of M.N. Roy, one of the great leftist leaders this country has produced. Even Lenin called him later to Moscow, and he agreed with him, he disagreed with him, stayed there for 7 years as a very big leftist, and then ran when Stalin got the reins of power. So all this happened. And I have another 10 minutes. Have I? I hope I have.
Sir, yes, sir.
So I'll go on. And her journal I wrote first. I wrote the 30 or 40 pages on the computer. It came to about 60 pages in the novel, about all that to start with. But I'll read as I was offered the book. The editor had worked with me as in my short story book on islands, and she asked me for a book. She took over Simon and Schuster, and this Seema Singh is coming back from Kangra. She's coming back in a train. She's coming from the hills. I don't make it specific that it is from Kangra. Sometimes I'm reading the first 2 pages, and much later I found that these 2.5 pages, which I just wrote for the editor to sample the offer of a book, became the bedrock, metaphorical bedrock of the novel. Sometimes you get down at the wrong station. Am I audible, madam? I hope I'm.
You are.
Sometimes you get down at the wrong station. You find it is also the wrong night, or worse, wrong dream. It happens when time has not got its screws fixed right. Time never got a mechanical engineering degree from a reputed college. Our auto mechanics do a better job as they steal hubcaps near rear view mirrors or the car itself. They are good at screwing. So are lawyers, but that's another world. Law courts, I mean, a metaphor in miasmal mist. How I love my alliterations, Mama. So these are not letters to Mama, these are chapters, and she brings her mother wherever she can. Law courts mean the surreal suspension of belief. How's that for a definition? You need to be careful when you are tired, and I show. I had enjoyed it for a while as we set out at dusk. We moved out of the station, steel trappings and the foothills fanned out, while trees and pylons slipped by. Feeling twilight slowly chiseled away at the shrinking landscape. When it got dark, I watched the lighted geometries of our glass windows spill across the tracks and race back to nowhere. She's traveling in a train, obviously. Yes, I was returning home, but things change. Time is the culprit again. It changes without notice. The damp on the window glass didn't let me see much. As the night train grated to a halt, I found myself disoriented. She has gone to sleep. If you don't shout, where am I? Guys will look at you in an odd manner. You sense you are in some sort of trouble. I did. Damp on the window pane prevented me from seeing where I was. Told you that. The dream didn't tell me, let me sleep. The dream didn't let me see beyond the eyelids. I seemed to have been everywhere. It had been something like a rim of the earth, parikrama down there. I mean, between me and the closed eyelids. She's talking about the dream, of course. When I got down, I had been fighting brush and bramble every yard in my hazy half dream. Now it was concrete reality. I was in a maelstrom of torsos and elbows. I called out to the porters, Jaldi aao, trolley lao. There was no one there. I mean, porters, trolleys, were there in their rust red. The trolleys were there, the porters were not, and she didn't realize why. She almost wanted to shout, "Coolies!" Sorry, but the coolies went to the Caribbean, didn't they? There were no shoulders to offer. You could unload your baggage on. The steps leading to the overbridge were not a party. The whole world seemed to be there climbing to nowhere. You lug your bags, your kurta sticking to your back like a second skin. The monsoon rains are here. Sand doesn't lash Charbagh anymore. Charbagh is the name of the Lucknow station. The night moths hover around the platform lights. The Urdu poets make a big deal out of Shama and Parvana, flame and moth, the male dying at the touch of his beloved's beauty. Let the bugger get his hands on her, and within 5 years of wedlock, he'll go for a mistress while she is having her third baby. So much for poetry, not forgetting love. The hills were better. I understood the language of the wind in the poplars. I knew a Himalayan thrush the moment I spotted its blue in the shrub. The night sky was sharper there. Star clusters spoke to you. Orion, Taurus, the bull with its horn, and of course, the great bear, the only constellations I can read. Isn't it a shame you live over 2 decades in this universe? You see, she has to tell the reader that she is just over 20, but she brings it in quietly. Isn't it a shame you live over 2 decades in the universe and all you know in the skies are 3 constellations? But I am here. Lucknow is another language. I spot an ikka, tanga, tum tum, call it what you will, a one horse carriage, the driver clicking his tongue to encourage the horse. There are no cycle rickshaws to be seen. Where is everybody? What has happened to this bloody place? I notice that the Tonga driver has a skull cap and a mixed black and white beard. Now, if we can only agree at this hour, Pesarbag, I shout as I struggle with 4 other passengers, all equally desperate. Crowds and desperation are twin brothers, I feel. Too many people in the country. We want less bums, torsos, legs, sterilize the fellows. This will come to haunt her. And then she takes out 50 rupees. 50 bucks, I shout, flashing the first notes I can scrape out of my purse. He lets me in, telling the others respectfully to wait, doesn't elbow them out. Vanishing dregs of Lucknowi, Tehzeeb. You don't have to give me all that, he says. When I get down at home, he accepts only 35 and waits till I get my key into the lock. Always a tricky business at night. The street light across the road has turned iridescent in the haze. I struggle and manage. That's the story of my life. To open the house. Locks click open now and then. Those spaces don't. I'm home. At night, I noticed the trains and the sound of trains ran through my mind on parallel tracks. One dream, 2 tracks. And as a metaphor goes, the uncertainty of coming home carries through the novel. I want to say 2 or 3 other things I've noted down. I write about people, not phantoms, okay, or jinns. stories about everyday life, stories woven around flesh and blood. There, you can have an aside. I have an aside. LM dreams of a camel, which is fleshless. It's a dead camel, but it still moves, and it moves across the border into Pakistan, and the rangers run because the moonlight shines on his bones, on his skeleton, and they think it is a trap from the side of the Indians. And there are two topaz, bits of topaz in his eyes. And when the camel returns, it also returns later. They put heroin in the eye sockets. It's just one page, but it is a slightly horrific. And that is what that little girl, the dreams that she gets. These are not long dreams, sequences, dreamscapes that float or try to float a good foot above reality. These are flesh and blood people living their lives not to humdrum and faced with situations where any of us can find ourselves in. No tomfoolery, no hocus pocus. I do this hocus pocus thing sometimes in my short stories. There are a few of them where it is because I grew up when the South American novel was really coming up. If you noticed, when I was in Oxford for a year, the South American writers, the Central American writers were on the top of the world. Losa and Marquez and Borges. Borges has been an influence on me, at least on my short stories, not on my novels. The main characters remain central to the novels. For Pepper and Christ, this was my first novel. It was on the voyage of Vasco da Gama, and I believe in the epic scale. The scale has to be wide and big. And so Portugal, the Iberian continent or subcontinent or peninsula, whatever you call it, peninsula is the word, that was trying to vie with Venice and Genoa, who were trading with the Arabs, were trading with Saladin and all the rest after the first few crusades. So all that, including an old crusader, comes into the novel. And the biggest compliment one of the biggest compliments I've had is a neighbor of mine who retired as a secretary to the government of India said that, look, I'm on page 90 something, 93 or 94. And I feel that an Egyptian is writing because I put the pilot, who was a Kutchi, who brought him from Milind, Vasco da Gama, to Malabar. I put him in Cairo. That was the idea, the agenda, that Cairo, the Tel Aviv coast now Tel Aviv. In those days, it was different. All that era, the way they lived their lives comes through. That was the first novel. Then came Ancestral Affairs. This is, I gave my, it is my father's family, 100-year-old photograph I gave as the cover, but it has nothing to do with my family or my parental family. It is about a father and a son, but the partition comes in, Junagadh comes in. I was in Junagadh for 4 years as a child, from 1945 to 1948. And the scenes are very clear. I mean, what the princes and the Nawab of Junagadh thought when they joined Pakistan. That is the only partition novel which is centered in Junagadh and not in Punjab or in East Bengal as it was known as. And the last thing, I cannot take an oath. I have kept away from dystopian endings, except in my first novel, because that was the reality. The Portuguese just killed and killed and killed, nothing else, as they came in. But the most important thing in the novel, which I have kept for the last, is that it is a veiled allegory. What do I mean by that? Suppose you write on the Black Death today, and you are actually writing about the virus, the Chinese virus, which is affecting all of us. I have done a clutch of poems on the Black Death recently. Again, it is both allegory and it is actually on the Black Death. Okay. Thank you. And I'm waiting for the questions or whatever you have to say. Thank you, Deepaji. You've been very kind to me.
No, sir, we are grateful to you. Sir, we will take the questions now. Let me see what are the questions that have come.
Questions or comments?
Actually, there is a comment actually. They are thanking you. And at the same time, there is a remark that the story is full of historical allusions.
Yes. But there is much between the mother and the daughter. The mother has to even go to jail because she goes, the McCarthyism in America. You can imagine how much I had to study for this novel. I had to read about Mexico, read about Canada, read about what is the last thing we talked about. And there it is. And McCarthy and Hoover. Hoover was the FBI chief. And for about 20 years, it was a disaster for America. And they chased people all over, put them in jail. Even if you had slightly leftist leanings, and the mother remains a staunch communist. And when M.N. Roy comes disguised as Dr. Mehmood, there is a full scene, I mean, in Bombay. Go ahead, please. Sorry, I butted in. My apologies.
In fact, our students and scholars are actually wanting to listen to you more. So there's a question, what inspired to write this novel?
What is?
What is the inspiration? What made you write this novel?
I'll tell you. What made me really write is about M.N. Roy. I was an ASP in Dehradun, my first posting in 1960, when Ellen Roy, his wife, he had already died. Ellen Roy was murdered and was murdered by the grandson of the driver who came in to have a drink. And she came down and they met, and the fellow thought that it would expose him and he strangled her. And I had never heard of Eamon Roy. I was about 22 years old. And I felt very embarrassed that Eamon Roy is such a great man. Even today, a retired IAS officer asked me, "Who's Eamon Roy?" It is a bit of a shame. I mean, if you take the great political leaders of India, I would take Nehru, Subhash Bose, and Eamon Roy. He was an intellectual. He's written very many books. He quarreled with Lenin. He had the guts to go to China, fight for liberty, Then Chenkashek, how shall I put it, let him down. Then he traveled through the Gobi Desert. At the age of 15, he was bringing in a ship of explosives. He was a revolutionary. So I thought about writing also about M.N. Roy, but M.N. Roy gets just a few pages, a few chapters, and nothing more. That's my answer.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Next question is, what do you enjoy writing the most, novels or poems? What is your first love, novels
I,
or poems?
you see, a poem is something short and sharp. The idea, I don't use the word inspirations and all for myself. I mean, I think these are big words, but the idea comes to you and you write it. And these days I'm writing half poems because then I get up and possibly have breakfast somewhere or a cup of tea and roam around, and then the poem vanishes. My notebooks are full of half poems at the moment.
Yes, sir.
So, but a novel is a very great pleasure. Carlos Fuentes, the Portuguese novelist, I'm happy with. I've read 4 or 5 of his books. He's dead. He's died just a year back or something. Carlos Fuentes, and he said that a short story is a boat, while a novel is an ocean liner. And if you have a liner, then you have to have its electronics and you have its 100 things in a liner you need, and that is what a challenge is. And then the challenge is there. The challenge to people it with people, I mean, populate it with people, I'm sorry, and have characters grow through those 300 pages that you write or 250 pages that you write. uh, you have to characters grow. I mean, when I launched this in Bombay,
Yes, sir.
um, um, two people, the great Benegal, Sham Benegal, and Anil Dharkar launched it in Bombay. And they said this should have been a novel of 400 pages. Why did you shut it out in 220? Because I don't want to write 400 pages. The reader gets tired, fatigued. I don't want to fatigue the reader. So I think this was an achievement to bring in so much in 220 or 230 pages. That's my answer.
Thank you, sir, for your answer. So one question is like, you talk about the Black Death poems, which is very relevant to today's
Yes.
time. Can you read one of these poems to us?
Who's?
Black Death poems.
Yes. You want me to read it out?
If you have, just a part of it maybe. There is a question. Uh, you have reflected that uh, the effects of flood.
Sorry?
You have talked about the effects of flood in Ghagra in Spate. So, do you have similar idea to represent the gruesome form of corona in the
You
form
know,
of poems that
your,
took place?
your scholars have read my old poems, Ghagra and Spade, yes.
And they're
That
thinking
was
that whether,
that was something real. I mean, my wife and I went in a railway trolley, the one which is pushed, and we because there was no other way to go. The roads were full of the river. The roads were full of the river, and it was quite an experience. Yes, in those days, whatever I saw, I wrote about it straight away. And that is how the first book and the second book of my poetry, my first 2 poetry volumes, that's how they came in 1968, 69, 70. I
yes,
go
sir.
back a long way. Under Orion was published in 1970. So it's 50 years. This is the 50th year of my first publication.
Okay. So another question coming up is, do you think there is there, do you think that there is still a strong readership for Indian English writing?
Yes. More and more people are studying English, and not that they are leaving Hindi. I believe Hindi literature is prospering, thriving, and more and more people, in fact, a lot of English poets, by which I mean poets writing in English originally, are taking to regional and the national language. And I think it's a very good combination. And I think the English readership is massive. And Indian writers, say 10 years or 20 years back, with Salman Rushdie and Amitabh Ghosh, the novelist, Vikram Seth, and Nissim Ezekiel, Ramanujan, uh, and the recent ones, Arundhati Subramaniam,
Roy.
Arundhati Subramaniam, not Roy. I'm talking about Arundhati Subramaniam.
Subramanian.
She's a better poet than Arundhati Roy is a novelist. She has just written one novel, and she's got so much tremendous publicity out of it. Good novelist, but I think the Ranjit Hoskote, Jeet Thayil is Vikram Seth. Poets are doing very well. Apart, if you take these two novelists out, Salman Rushdie and Amitabh Ghosh, uh, we, as poets, I'll say, we'll go round by round with the novelists. We're just as good. The poets are as good. But at the moment, I'm talking as a novelist.
Sir, yes, sir. So
Yeah.
another question, quite a long one. So I'll read it out.
Sorry?
You, it's a long question, sir, but I am
Yes.
going to read it out.
Please.
Since you have written many poems on Black Death, which happened on 14th century, somewhere 14th century the scholar is writing. So we accept what everyone says, but is it fair to criticize this coronavirus to be a Chinese virus only? Because it's easy to accept the agenda, not the exact fact.
Shall I answer this?
Yes, sir.
My answer is that the wet markets of Wuhan, there are also wet markets in Indonesia, incidentally. They are terrible. We are eating pangolins. We are eating civet cats. What is wrong with humankind? I mean, we have to move now towards vegetarianism, and it's in some way or the other. I'm not a vegetarian, but I'm a vegetarian for 5 days a week. So it is their eating habits, and this suddenly it jumped from animals to human beings, that particular virus. So China is blamed, and it did not tell the world that such a serious thing is happening. It should have forewarned the world much earlier. So China is squarely to blame in through my small, light reading on the subject. I'm no scholar on the virus, but I call it the Chinese virus in my columns, which I write in the Tribune.
So finally, okay. So I think there are no more questions.
Yes, go ahead.
So there is a question like, can you throw some light on literary translation? How far
On
is
the
it on literary translation? Translation of literature, literary text. How far is it different from original writing? So through translations, people get to know about literature of, literature across the world. So, what is your feeling regarding translation work?
I I think they are asking the wrong person. I'm not into translations, nor am I into. I mean, translations have become an industry now. The seminar after seminar on translations. I'm not one of those people. But if you had no translations, where would we have read Dostoevsky? Where would we have read all what we are reading? The poetry on the Holocaust, for example, Rilke, and all the others. And I'm translation literature is translation. And please don't forget, an idea that comes to you is different when you put it on the printed page. You put it in words, that idea, and so we are all the while translating the inspiration, the idea, the dream which comes to your mind is different from what is there on the page or on the screen if you are a filmmaker. So I honor translations a lot, and I'm sorry. For example, I've done a lot of Russian reading, Russian literature from my college days, and now when I hear the poets, they say that Dostoevsky and Tolstoy sound the same in English translations. Well, uh, Brodsky says there have been sentences by Dostoevsky which run for 3 pages. So they wrote in different styles, and yet it doesn't come through to us. But now I believe the translations today are much better than they were 30 years ago or 40 years ago when I read Brothers Karamazov or Crime and Punishment.
Okay, so, what will be your advice to the budding scholars? How, if they want to make a career of writing, what are the things that they should be doing?
I think they should firstly get their facts right, and the facts should not bind them. You should not be led by the nose, by just what is factual. Then you may as well become a sociologist. You know, you must have give full rein to your imagination
Imagination.
and keep an exercise book. Note down whatever strikes you. These days, I get a story in my head, and by the afternoon, it has slipped out. I've just lost 2 stories in the last 2 or 3 days. So it just happens. I'm possibly getting old and getting forgetful as well. But you should keep your pen and paper with you and keep noting down and keep going back to it and do whatever writing you can. And if you fail as a writer, go into translations, go into criticism. That is also very important. I believe, for example, for my poetry, all the critics, they would go to my first 2 books and, oh, violence, policeman, there's so much violence in his writing. I think that's nonsense because I stayed only 16 years in the police and I'm in my 80s. So you have to take a entire lifetime or a life when you write about it. And I find critics both ignorant and arrogant. Sorry.
No, sir, these are things that should be told also. Okay, sir. So with that, we will be ending the session today.
Thank
And
you.
thank you. Thanks a lot. And we will be having more such, webinars. That is the new normal. If we cannot do conferences, So it will be done in
have,
this way,
have,
online.
I have a Zoom session on the 8th with Janki Devi College, but that
Okay,
is
sir.
on poetry. And it is on writing poetry during the virus, during the times of the virus. That is where I'll talk about the Black Death.
Sir, we want to also have a poem session by you. We will get time from you.
This is impossible. I think Zoom is easier than. Uh,
Zoom, yeah. So we can do it on Zoom also, sir.
let's see. Let's.
Thank you, sir. With that lot, we are really grateful to you that you can make it and you have given your precious time to our budding scholars.
One question: has
Yes, sir.
even a single student read this book, the novel?
Uh,
Have you
they
got
can
it in
write
your
in the chat
library?
box. They can
Have you
write in
got
the
it? Have you got it in your library? The novel.
some of the books we are getting, sir. Some of the books, the one that you said before also during
Okay.
the conference, we are getting those books. Okay,
Thank you.
sir. Thank you.